All right, hello Chiefs Kingdom, and welcome to the MKE ChiefsCast live from the Wolf Den Special Edition, where we'll be joined by a very special guest. As always, I'm Josh.
And I'm Chris, and our special guest today is the Executive Director of Research and Development at Pro Football Focus and fellow Chiefs fan. We have Eric Eager with us.
All right, we are, of course, presented by Complete Weddings and Events, your leading provider of photo, video, DJ, photo booth, lighting, and coordination services. So let's go ahead and get to work. So, Eric, the first thing that we want to get into, you write for Pro Football Focus. Anybody who looks at stats even a little bit knows that PFF is the expert place to go. So talk to us about your journey that found you as the trusted Chiefs spreadsheet ninja warrior.
Well, that's a fun story. I went to grad school in Lincoln, Nebraska, and during that time, I tried to save as much money as possible. So I didn't have cable, and I didn't have so I only watched the games on TV that were on, and the Chiefs were on. And in that time, they were a very plucky team, And so, they were, that was a 2010 year with Matt Castle and Charlie Weiss and all those guys. I grew up in Minnesota. My wife grew up in Wisconsin. So we had dueling fandoms. And so we decided to get rid of those and become Chiefs fans as a couple. And then, that kind of led me to where we are now. After I finished grad school, I went and I taught at University of Wisconsin La Crosse in Southwest Wisconsin for 6 years. I was a math professor, and during that time, I was still a pretty avid, fantasy football player, and I always, I played football in college. So I thought I knew a decent amount about the game, but there was always these, alternative viewpoints that always enticed me. And so in 2015, I started writing and doing data collection for PFF. So I started sort of on the ground, just collecting data on weekends as a hobby, writing. I think one of my first stories was about how the Chiefs should not use the franchise tag on Eric Berry, that they should have signed him originally after the year where he beat cancer and was an all-pro for them in 2015. And eventually the people, higher up in the company started to notice, and my job became less of sort of a writer and less of a, data collector and more of a synthesizer and a sort of a model builder. And then in 2018, they eventually hired myself and my colleague, George Shahuri, as the leaders of what now is called research and development. And since then, that's kind of been my job for 2.5 years. So, I went from being a math professor in Wisconsin to being a football analyst, and that's kind of where my journey has led me to today.
So we'd be remiss, being from Wisconsin, the Milwaukee Chiefs fan group, to not ask you the question. Your wife is from where on the glove in Wisconsin?
Okay. Well, it's Kendall, Wisconsin, which is so there's Kendall, Elroy, Toma. Toma is probably what you guys have heard of, right on there.
Toma, I've certainly heard
90.
of.
Yeah, that too.
So kind of in the middle of the state, and then La Crosse, well, not in the middle, it's a little bit still west still, but then La Crosse was like, the only university within an hour of her hometown. So when I had an opportunity to teach there, I decided to, and I very much liked La Crosse. La Crosse is a beautiful place.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Toma's about a half hour away from the Wisconsin Dells, so you can go get your water slide on and everything. Yeah, good stuff.
That's right.
All right, so talking about analytics, based on what's almost an entire season of data, what do you think is the biggest improvement need that the Chiefs have?
Well, it's not so much need. I mean, this year was a year where every team, you look across the border with you guys, the Minnesota Vikings have had opt-outs, they've had injuries, and it's really hurt their season. You look at, Denver Broncos didn't have a quarterback for 1 week. Tampa Bay has had new players, right? It took them a long time to acclimate. Kansas City was always going to be in a good position to succeed this year because they're based upon making big bets at really important positions, right? Their head coach is, I think, the best head coach in all of football, and their quarterback is, with maybe one exception, the best quarterback in all of football. And a lot of the other things don't really matter when that's the case, right? Mitchell Schwartz is the best right tackle in football. He's probably the fourth best player on the team, and he has barely played this season. Mike Remmers is a guy who's bounced around the league, and when he was out against the Saints, it showed a lot, right? They've had trouble at center this year, going back and forth between Ryder and Kilgore. The guard positions haven't been great. On defense, right? Like Juan Thornhill, who I think had a fabulous rookie year, has really turned into a backup behind Daniel Sorensen because of injuries. And I think some of the issues with rehabilitation in a year when you don't have, that second year jump is less likely when you don't have an off season. They've had issues. I think the biggest weakness that they've had this year is the fact that they paid Frank Clark over $20 million a year, and he's really, with the exception of this past week, not produced much in the way of pressure or sacks on the quarterback. So it's a number of things, and frankly, I think none of them, given the way the Chiefs are constructed, are going to keep them from winning the Super Bowl in 2020 or being the model franchise, the new Patriots in the NFL for the long term.
Gotcha. So is there any area of the Chiefs that you think that is being undervalued, that you would have a statistical argument as better than people would think just looking at them?
Well, part of me thinks that they don't spend enough money on the secondary. They don't spend enough draft capital on the secondary, right? I wrote an article, about, in March of last year where I argued that, the secondary is a weak link system. Your fourth best player or fifth best player is how you go in the secondary. And the Chiefs, I think, somewhat have played with fire there. In 2018, obviously they started the year with David Amerson as one of the corners, and he was so bad in the preseason that they had to cut him all together and go with Orlando Scandrick off the street, right? And then eventually they traded Parker Enger, who's a fourth-round pick previously, for Charvarius Ward, who was, I think, an undrafted or maybe seventh-round pick for Dallas. Their pedigree at the cornerback position is lacking. I mean, Brashad Breeland was a street free agent for much of the last 2 years, and he's a starter, and he's performed pretty well. Charvarius Ward's performed pretty well despite not being highly regarded. L'Jarius Sneed has been one of the best rookies in the entire NFL,
Yes,
and he was a mid-round draft pick. If I'm running the Kansas, and Rashad Fenton at 6th-round pick last year was very serviceable. They're in my estimation, I think they're playing with fire a little bit at the position by not, using more, signing a better free agent, using higher price. But for the Kansas City over the past 3-4 years, it hasn't necessarily popped up as a real issue.
So I'm just going to ask this question straight up. What would you rate Veach and Reed's building of a team on a scale of 1 to 10? What would you give them for a grade?
Well, the results have been a 10. You can't argue with that. I mean,
sure.
Andy put it all on the table, traded up when they had a quarterback who was good enough to win. The year 2016, they were the number 2 seed in the AFC, which was good enough to get a bye. They were 12-4, and it was a lucky 12-4, but most coaches would not have said, look, we need to improve at this position. And so they traded up, took Mahomes. They traded up a pick. We'll watch this guy tonight on Monday Night Football. They traded a pick that ended up being Tre'Davious White, who's an all-pro corner to take Mahomes. And that takes a lot of guts. And, for that, and then retooling their offense in 2017 while Mahomes wasn't even the starter, and Alex Smith led the league in passer rating that year. All those things get an A for me. Now, nitpicking, Brett Veach has never traded back. He's always traded up. He's never traded back. And so, they've gotten really lucky this year that Sneed has played really well, that Willie Gay appears to be a decent football player. Clyde was, okay this year. Taking a running back in round 1 is always sort of a no-no from an analytics perspective, but it's not like he stunk, right? Like that's not a terrible pick. They've used a lot of draft picks on defensive linemen who really haven't been elite level players. Tano Passigno, Noddy, Saunders, those kind of players. Breeland Speaks is not even on the team anymore, and they traded up for him. McCole Hardman still isn't a starter despite trading up for him. So there is a lot of misses, but all GMs have misses. And to me, again, so I would give Veach probably an 8, maybe a 7. I give Reed a 10 for taking the groceries and making a really good meal out of it.
Gotcha.
Maybe
Gotcha.
to follow up on this a little bit, Eric, I guess, could you give a grade maybe for the short term and one for the long term? Because, one thing that's on the horizon is the fact that, we've got so much money invested in Frank Clark, Tyrann Mathieu, Chris Jones.
Yeah.
I guess, let's say 2 or 3 years from now, are they in a good position to continue building this team for the long term, or will they potentially run into some issues?
That's a great question. I think the calculus becomes different when your quarterback is on a big deal, right? Sammy Watkins, I think all of us as Chiefs fans, having watched them, like I was at the AFC Championship game when he scored the touchdown deep. It brought the house down. It brought chills, and I'm like, I forgot for a second that they spent 3 years, $48 million on him, right? And you're paying $16 million a year for a player who's probably your third best option on a good day. You can make those mistakes when your quarterback is on a rookie contract. You can no longer make those mistakes, right? Anthony Hitchens has been basically a replacement level linebacker for this team for 3 years, and he was $9 million APY. You can't make those mistakes when Patrick Mahomes is making a $500 million. Now, they've done a good job of structuring the deals where it's not catastrophic. Mahomes' cap hit isn't even Jared Goff level or Carson Wentz deal for a few years. That gives the league time to figure out its finances post-pandemic. That gives the Chiefs time to sort of like figure things out. I mean, Watkins won't be on this team next year. Hitchens, I think, will, the way it's structured up, but maybe Sorensen won't be on the team next year. Mitchell Schwartz, again, a question mark. Eric Fisher, again, a question mark. They drafted Lucas Niang, who opted out, probably as a replacement for those guys. But you guys are right. I mean, Tyrann Mathieu's a wonderful football player, but there's a chance that he might not be on the team in a year or two. And so in the short term, running it back, well, the results are clear. I mean, there are road opponents this year that weren't AFC West opponents for 48-22, and they went 5-0 against them. They have had a great season, and in many ways because of the continuity. Long term, I think Veach and company are going to have to deploy a different strategy as far as trying to win, because when a great deal of your players make a great deal of the money, you have to hit on the L'Jarius Sneeds of the world. You have to hit on the Willie Gays of the world. And, 2020 looks great as far as a return is concerned. You look at some of those other drafts, the Breeland Speaks draft, those kind of things, McCole Hardman even. Some of those are not necessarily what you're paying for. And when you take 2 or 3 draft picks to trade up to get them, the stakes are a lot higher.
Yeah, I think we're all rooting for him to get this right, obviously. Do you like the prognosis, or do you have more serious questions than?
Here's the thing. I think Andy's enough in charge where Brett Veach is, good at what he doesn't shoulder as big of a load. And I think that's good, because I think Andy Reid has a documented track record of putting, especially in big games, Patrick Mahomes and company in a position to have success. And I think Veach, as long as he doesn't make catastrophic mistakes over and over again, will win the day. And the Chiefs have shown that they're willing to give up on a general manager who doesn't do what they want them to do. I mean, John Dorsey was not bad. I mean, he wasn't great. The contracts to Justin Houston and Eric Berry were desperate, and they were the product of a poor decision-making process and the like. But, he wasn't terrible. He took a roster that was 2-14 and made them a playoff contender the following year. He was in the building when they drafted Mahomes. Now, he wasn't the one making the decision, but he was in the building. I think Veach's his role is secondary enough to make my worries secondary at best.
So in addition to making the good meal, Reed gets enough contribution to the shopping list when you're looking for the food that you feel good about his contribution, and that Veach is put in a good position.
Right. Yeah. It's like, it's like when they draft Clyde. It's like, well, you think Clyde will succeed? I'm like, well, it doesn't actually really matter, right? If he's the best running back in football and Mahomes regresses to being an average player, it's not going to move the needle very much. And if Mahomes is who Mahomes has been, the Clyde's not going to offer all that much more over anybody else, right? Like, I think, Veach is not a marginal participant in this, but I don't think he's necessarily as like his decision-making process does not move the needle nearly as much as we may think.
Good stuff. All right, so let's jump into the entire league, and you kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier, but let's just ask the question: who's your MVP? You're voting for MVP tomorrow. Who are you voting for?
Two or 3 weeks ago, I would have said Patrick Mahomes. I think that now, I think you have to give a small edge to Aaron Rodgers. I know on the betting market, it's moved significantly over the past few weeks. Obviously, with Mahomes, you have the highlight plays, you have the lack of mistakes, although he made a few yesterday against the Falcons. You have the performances against top opponents. I mean, we think about Tampa Bay and New Orleans, but they've also had, they also beat the brakes off of the Ravens and then beat Buffalo in Buffalo early in the year. But I think even by our numbers, I think Rodgers is a little bit more responsible for his team's success. They have, less receivers there. They have Adams, who I think is about Kelsey level at wide receiver, but they don't have a Tyreek Hill. They don't have a Sammy Watkins. They don't have, any of the complementary pieces that Kansas City has. They have a better offensive line, so that's a ding on Rodgers. But I think it's Rodgers by the slightest of margins.
Okay.
So what, I guess what factors make that a slim margin? Because you could look at the stats from a high level and think Rodgers is actually running away with it, but is that actually the case?
No. I mean, expected points added on a per play level, they're about the same. Rodgers is taking care of the football better as far as even if you ignore interceptions, he's throwing fewer negatively graded plays. I think he's something at like 8%, which is unbelievable. Mahomes is more like 12%. So 1 out of every 8 Mahomes throws, we would grade poorly, which is, Rodgers is more like 1 out of every, 13, 14 throws. So it's significant there. Mahomes has better high-end plays, so his brilliant plays are better. I think he's the best scrambler in football. So when you look at him, when the play breaks down, I don't think there's anybody I trust more in the NFL to make a play than Patrick Mahomes. But here's the other thing: it's also a who do you think will win the award? I think Rodgers will win the award, and I think he'll go away with it. I think it's closer than that, but Rodgers going into the week was worth about 1/10 of a win more than Mahomes. And I think that gap widened a little bit this week. I don't think Mahomes is going to play in week 17. And since it's a regular season award, Rodgers will probably beat the brakes off of the Bears this week and sort of walk away with the award. So that's kind of where I sit. Gotcha. I mean, both of you'd obviously any day of the week rather have Mahomes given his age and I think his talent level, but Rodgers this season put a season together for the ages.
Yeah, and of course it's subjective, and you've got all the things about the age and everything like that. So, one more question for you before we get going. The next time the Chiefs put somebody in the Ring of Honor and Hall of Fame, who should it be in your prospects?
Well, I think it should be Derek Johnson.
Okay.
Derek Johnson's probably one of the most underrated linebackers in the history of the NFL. It's going to be weird because when you look at the league as a whole, so we just had Kevin Green pass away, a former Packer coach. And, a lot of the linebackers that made the Hall of Fame back then were edge players like Holly and, Tamba Hali, Jared Allen type players. And they got all the sacks and all the big hits and all that kind of stuff. And then the middle linebackers that would make the Hall of Fame were sort of these these big bruising guys who would get a lot of tackles, who would be missing front teeth, Jack Lambert type players. Mm-hmm. And as the league has evolved, that inside linebacker position has evolved with it. And Derek Johnson was, I have to go back and look at the stats, but Derek Johnson was one of the best players at limiting passing into his coverage. And, that really, early on, it was, Todd Haley, it was a Todd Haley, Romeo Crennel defense. He did really well there. When it transitioned to the Bob Sutton defense, he was just a player sideline to sideline. He wasn't the best run defender in the world, but running has, decreased in value over time. And just being able to neutralize the middle of the football field the way that he did, make big plays at times with interceptions and pass breakups and stuff, I think he would be next. Obviously, I think the other contenders would be Jamal Charles, Tamba Hali, even I don't know, like Eric Berry, I think deserves it. Although on the way out, I think he rubbed people the wrong way.
Sure.
But Derek Johnson to me is the epitome of like somebody who looks at the numbers like me would, I think, value Derek Johnson a lot more than people who maybe don't. Even though I think almost all Chiefs fans knew he was good, I think he's being possibly undersold.
You have no idea how good he was. Yeah.
I always remember the 2016 game against Oakland where he tore his Achilles. I mean,
yeah,
I could see a big drop off in the defense. I mean, it wasn't just because Dan Sorensen was getting trucked after that,
yes.
but there was definitely a big void left by him.
Well, and even the 2011 season, so that was the year where, so 2010 they had the pop-up year. It was kind of fluky, but the defense was good. And in 2011, I think Johnson tore his Achilles on the first week of the season, and they gave up like 70 points in the first two games to Buffalo and Detroit, and rest in peace. But Javon Belcher just couldn't cover anybody, right? And they just they don't have, that second linebacker position now is almost always a nickel. I went to, I was at that Chiefs game where Le'Veon Bell ran for 170 on us, and the two middle linebackers in that game were Ramik Wilson and Daniel Sorensen. And I thought it was a good tactic to let the Steelers run on them because that only allowed 18 points and it forced, them into, kicking 6 field goals as opposed to scoring 70-yard touchdowns on Terrence Mitchell. But it's still, if Johnson's in there, maybe it's 4.5 yards a carry instead of 5.5 yards a carry. And I think, obviously players like that, in addition to the way he can cover backs out of the backfield and tight ends, and sometimes slot receivers if put in a pinch, like his value is immense. I think Eric Berry's similar. Eric Berry's similar for sure. I think Eric Berry got a lot more publicity early on because he was a top 5 pick or top 6 pick. And he made Pro Bowls early that he shouldn't have made. But post-cancer, Eric Berry at the free safety spot was about as good as it got.
Yeah. All right. One last question. This is just going to be a yes, no. Ring of Fame, Dustin Colquitt.
Yeah.
Awesome. I think we agree with that. Thank you again for your time. This has been our absolute pleasure having this discussion with you. And seriously, thank you very much.
Anytime, guys. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Awesome.